Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, Brian was going through some losses and bad judgments. He put money into his own theater, but it was costing him more than it should have, and he wasn't making any money on it. Then he realized he needed to trim his business down, and that was rough for him. Brian's father suffered a heart attack and realized that he had to slow down on his work, which he had regarded as therapy. Lastly, Brian lost his personal assistant, Wendy Hanson. She had been his right hand for a while, but she reached her limit with his bossy ways. He still loved her and said that he wanted to remain friends with her. Brian never liked losing contact with people he cared about. So let's see what's going on today. Christmas 1966, Brian had the highs and lows going on in his life. Walking around his house, he told Joanne, his secretary, "I think we should look a little festive here." So Joanne went out and returned with cards and decorations to place in the elegant lounge and his study. He was enthusiastically signing his 400 Christmas cards with a flourishing, distinctively formal signature now known so well throughout show business and beyond. The cards went to artists and staff, past and present, business associates, friends, and contacts. Some of the names of the people were not associated with Brian: Alan Williams in Liverpool, David Frost, Princess Margaret, all the Rolling Stones individually, Peter Sellers, Elvis Presley, the Four Tops, etc. It was a joyful season, but Brian had private worries. It was so multifaceted that a friend once remarked to his secretary that Brian was on a collision course with himself. The Beatles had stopped touring, but Brian couldn't tell anybody. People would panic and think the Beatles were splitting up. If the reality became hard news, morale was already a problem, and it could get even worse. Sid Bernstein met with Brian in Britain for dinner. He had a hit group with the Young Rascals. He didn't know about the Beatles not touring, and he offered £350,000 for 2 concerts in one day in New York Shea Stadium in 1967. With the world's television rights, Sid said it could make millions. And Brian shook his head. "I can make no plans for the next year," he said somberly. John, Paul, George, and Ringo were maturing as men, and Eppie felt that they might not like how he was doing business management because of the pop world's grapevine from American musicians. He wondered if Alan Klein was still a threat to him. The Beatles, with Paul pushing it, were talking about launching their own company, Apple, to run tandem with Brian's management, Edwin Nims. Brian thought privately that it was absurd. They should stick to music, just as John Lennon had once told him to stick to counting the percentages. But Brian could not and did not want to stop them. It was clear, though, that the relationship they had had was weakening, however much togetherness still existed between them. And Brian had other worries, too. The Seville Theater was a problem that couldn't easily be solved. Epstein displayed a calm that had marked his style through the years. He thought if he didn't display that calm, his friends and colleagues would have alarm bells ringing. But he couldn't hide things from his discreet staff. His secretary, Joanne, would get a handwritten notes on her desk when she got to Chapel Street. An example, he wrote to her, "Joanne, under no circumstances am I to be disturbed. I will announce myself when I'm available. I'm aware that I may miss the Shea Press showing. Under no circumstances suggest to anyone I'm asleep. B.E." And another, asking for his butler to deliver him breakfast promptly at 3 p.m., he wrote to Joanne, "In strict confidence, I've decided to be officially unwell. Please do not tell anyone it's untrue, except family. Parentheses, he put, tell my brother, if he calls, that I'll explain why I'm unavailable later." Alistair Taylor called him several times, but half the time he couldn't get through to him. He was either in bed or Joanne was blocking his calls. When Brian appeared at Argyle Street, it became events, because sometimes Alistair said the door would open and Brian would be there standing, grinning, looking slightly flabby around the gills, but never out of his head. I never saw him smashed. I knew what was going on, but there was no point in me saying, "Brian, pull yourself together." What happened is that he became virtually a recluse. Yet when Brian was fully operational, he could be as cohesive, alert, and flamboyant as the man who 5 years before had galvanized Liverpool and the world with his methodical determination. Brian flew to Mexico on March the 1st. While he was there, he had optimism, energy, and good health. He avoided narcotics. He did have an expensive bill because of his forgetfulness. Brian had hired a car and abandoned it. Months later, Nat got a $3,000 bill from a rental company when they finally discovered the lost car on a roadside. When Brian got back to London, he had uncertainty and depression. Brian wanted to shape up. Privately, he wanted to explore the possibility of pulling himself out of NIMS in some way, maybe with a financial takeover. More than that, he wanted to rid himself of the chores of chairmanship and simply be the manager of the Beatles, Cilla, and Jerry. I think he should have had just those few people because that was more than enough to keep him busy. Even the Colonel had told him he had all the work he could handle managing Elvis. So then Brian phoned Larry Parnes with an invitation to tea at Chapel Street. Brian was in bed wearing a dressing gown over his pajamas, and he looked ill with a yellow complexion, suggesting he might have hepatitis. He proudly played Cilla's new single, and then Parnes played the new release by Billy Fury. He was a Liverpool singer that Brian would have liked to have managed, but he had his mind on wider issues. Parnes said that Brian told him he wanted to retire. He was fed up, worn out, and couldn't control the empire which NIMS had become. Epstein was in an escapist mood. He said he wanted to get away on a long cruise. He offered Parnes a senior role in NIMS, which was declined. Parnes told Brian that the moment you leave the company, it will fragment and then break up. So Brian became despondent. After 3 hours of trying to persuade Brian to unwind, Parnes left. It was the last time they would meet. Even with that, Brian's letters were that of anticipation and even humor. Brian wrote a letter to Derek Taylor in Los Angeles early 1967. On his personal notepaper, he wrote, "From Brian Epstein" at the top, and he said in a description of himself, "manager and frequent lunar." He wrote of how he was very busy. "I must have a few days' rest to prepare myself to receive the Four Tops, but in great form. Very happy about my Stigwood deal." And he was happy about the Beatles' new single due out February the 17th. Super smash, without question, one of their best. The titles, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. Years after the Beatles and Epstein had been accused by Liverpudlians of deserting their roots, Lennon and McCartney had returned to their teenage memories for songwriting inspiration and given their home city immortality with 2 songs that brilliantly evoked its unique atmosphere. Brian continued in his letter, referring to Strawberry Fields. "John tells me the latter is between Menlove Avenue and Beaconsfield Road. Do you think it'll help our image in Liverpool? I used to get the tram number 46 from Penny Lane to the Epsteins' Walton Road when I overslept and it was too late to accompany Daddy to work in his Triumph at 9 o'clock. The record, Brian mused, would probably kill 15 birds with one stone." Well, brown paper bag money was an undignified phrase that never existed in Epstein's vocabulary. It was coined by those around him to camouflage undercover tactics used by Brian and various concert promoters, particularly in America, for cash payments that could circumvent the tax authorities. Booking the Beatles was a profitable coup for many of them. A few $1,000s or a few £100 in cash handed to Epstein after some shows was their way of helping Brian reduce the effect of the monumental tax bills that followed each tour. Brian's lifelong attitude towards money reflected the artist in him. He was carefree about it, maybe because real money problems had never occurred during his pre-Beatles life. At NIMS, he was conscious of not leaving too many taps turned on for his staff to squander. His handling of big money was at odds with his meticulous nature. Even at NIMS and Whitechapel, he walked through the Liverpool streets with wads of money in his pockets. And he went to the Charlotte Street branch of NIMS. He would hand the cash to Edith Yates, the bookkeeper, saying, "Will you please count these and look after them?" Brian also had integrity. While he was prepared to accept cash for the Beatles, he was never prepared to oil the wheels for any of his artists or staff. The test came when his act, Silky, the folk group who had a hit with John Lennon's song "You Gotta Hide Your Love Away," was a top 10 hit in America. In New York, Alistair Taylor was there to start a promotional tour for the group, and he was told good news and bad. They could do 9 television shows for $1,000 each performance, but they could not get a work permit. Epstein was due in Manhattan shortly after Taylor got the news. Taylor told Brian that if they were to give a certain person $1,000 to oil the wheels, a work permit could be arranged. But Brian wouldn't give the money to Taylor. He said he never bought his artists into anything with cash and did not intend to start. Taylor argued that they had the Ed Sullivan TV show and 8 others on offer, an income of $9,000 in fees, plus it's such an enormous exposure, surely justified the method. Epstein, though, was adamant. The Silky were mad at Brian for his refusal to lend cash to Taylor, because at that time, Alistair Taylor was their personal manager. In London, they were waiting for details of their flight to New York, and they were told to return to Liverpool for Christmas. They never forgave Brian for what they saw as an effective curtailment of their career, and they split up shortly afterward. To the astonishment of those around him, Brian began to distance himself from the machinery of his central business. He didn't seem able to juggle his activities. It was a failure that could explain the problems that affected his growing empire. He was a manager of so many artists and instigator of so many projects, it ended up being self-defeating. He could only handle one topic at a time. He hated his meetings to be interrupted. Nothing was more urgent than the matter under discussion. Not even a telephone offer of a vast sum for a few seconds' work by the Beatles was allowed to steer his thoughts away from a domestic meeting with one of his staff. One day when Brian was in a meeting, there was a call from America. It's from a TV station. Would Brian allow the Beatles to appear on the Lucille Ball show? All the Fab Four had to do was stand on the corner in Piccadilly Circus while Miss Ball walked past them and did a double take. Brian told Don Black, the man who took the call, "Please do not bother me. I'm too busy." And then Don Black told the TV people, "It's impossible to get an answer. The man is in a meeting." And the TV man persisted. "This is terribly, terribly important." He explained how little it would tax the Beatles' energy or time. For that we would pay $100,000. But we must know now. We need him for 5 seconds. We have to arrange film crews. Black went into the meeting. "Brian, they won't take no for an answer, and they're offering," and he had written the vast sum on a piece of paper that he handed to Epstein. Epstein remained unfazed. "Oh, just tell them not to bother. For goodness sake. No, 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 no." He dismissed it, says Black, as if rejecting the offer for a cup of tea. So I'm going to stop the video here. In this episode, we see that Brian was feeling the pressure of having so many business things of his own creation to handle. If he had stuck with his favorite artists, the Beatles, Cilla Black, and Jerry and the Pacemakers, he would have been better off. Brian had ideas of retiring, of having a financial takeover of his businesses, and of taking a long cruise. It sounds like he was burned out, and that makes sense because, as we learned earlier, he didn't want to delegate business and ended up having too much to do all by himself. As it was said earlier, Brian was on a collision course with himself. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help me to keep the channel growing. As I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in, and if you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. If you purchase anything, I get a small commission that is no extra cost to you. More importantly, I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you.